Welcome back to Decentralized Voices, the show where we cut through the noise and amplify real conversations on rights, governance, and freedom across Canada. I'm your host, William Turner, and I'm coming to you from Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6 territory. In my work as an Indigenous law and policy advisor, I'm often asked to look at new legislation through a technical lens to find the gaps. But when I look at the One Canadian Economy Act, 2025, recently passed by the Mark Carney government, I'm looking through a lens of relationships. Relationships between people, between governments, and between our communities and the lands that sustain us all. The federal government is pitching this act, and specifically the Major Projects Office, or the MPO, as a breakthrough for national resilience. They're promising speed, cutting red tape, and offering a 10% equity for Indigenous nations. On the surface, it sounds like economic reconciliation. But today, I want to talk about why this efficiency is a trap. I'm going to walk you through why this act isn't just about building pipelines or mines. It's a profound re-centralization of federal authority that risks making constitutional rights inoperative in practice. Back then, the shift was framed as administrative efficiency, the feds handing control over to the provinces, but in reality, it allowed the provinces to criminalize Indigenous harvesting and ignore treaty promises. It turned a nation-to-nation relationship into a provincial regulatory hurdle. So we are seeing that same spirit in the Major Projects Office, their new substitution powers, right? Like under Section 33 of this framework, the minister can substitute a provincial or an even Indigenous-led assessment process with the federal Major Projects Office process, right? So on paper, they call this one project, one review. But as a native with a law degree, I see a direct challenge to the division of powers under Sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution Act, 1867. When the Major Projects Office designates a project as being in the national interest, it effectively invokes the federal paramountcy doctrine, which some people are familiar with. We saw the limits of this in a landmark case in 2007, Canadian Western Bank. The decision of the Supreme Court was clear. Paramountcy isn't a blank check, right? It only applies when there is an operational conflict where you literally cannot obey both a federal and a provincial law at the same time. So by allowing the Major Projects Office to preemptively substitute its own process and shield projects from judicial review for a period of 2 years, 24 months, the federal government is trying to skip this conflict entirely. They're attempting to occupy the field before a province or a nation can exercise their own jurisdiction over the project. This is a modern administrative version of the declaratory power under Section 92. A tool that allows Ottawa to declare a local work to be a advantage of Canada. We've seen this before with the CER, the Canada Energy Regulator. But here's the catch. The 1997 Delgamuukw case, right? The court ruled that provincial laws of general application cannot extinguish Aboriginal title. So if the Major Projects Office substitutes a process that ignores the specific territorial nature of that title, they're creating a massive legal liability for themselves, right? You cannot substitute away the honor of the crown. Now, let's talk about the most dangerous part of this act for communities, nations that I serve, right? The 2-year period, the 24-month clock. In Ottawa, the 24 months sounds like a long time to get a permit, but for the nations that I work with, decision-making doesn't happen on a stopwatch, right? It happens through ceremony, it happens through community gatherings, and slow, deliberate guidance of our elders. These aren't delays. These are inherent Indigenous legal orders, part of a process, right? So the Supreme Court in the Haida Nation and Chilcotin cases was very clear. The honor of the crown requires a process that genuinely seeks to address concerns of the parties. You can't just check a box for a ceremony. But when the Major Projects Office imposes these artificial timelines, they aren't just speeding up an economy. They are silencing a legal system that has existed since before Confederation, Indigenous legal orders. If we rush the process to meet quarterly earnings reports, we aren't just breaking a timeline, we're breaking Indigenous law. As the Chilcotin case established, title confers the exclusive right to decide how the land is used. Then there's the carrot, the 10% equity rule in the legislation here. So the act mandates Indigenous equity. Makes sense, it's part of the business right now, but it often comes in the form of non-voting shares. In my view, equity without governance is just a different form of subordination. It's like being given a seat at the table, but your mouth is taped shut. Even more troubling is the refusal recording mechanism in the legislation. If a nation decides not to accept an equity offer, the act allows the government to record that refusal as completed consultation, right? It turns a constitutional no, a right recognized in the Mikisew Cree case, it turns it into a green light for the proponent, which isn't very fair, you know. This is where we really need to pivot to a truly decentralized, reconciled model, right? In my brief to the IAAC, I propose 4 pillars of reform, right? The first one is automatic 50% Indigenous appointees on the boards, right? The Major Projects Office panels shouldn't just listen to this. We should be half of the decision makers on those panels. The second thing is perpetual revenue, right? Not just capped royalties that is paid out like after the corporate debt is cleared and the risks are managed, but a permanent share of the wealth of the land, you know, contributes to real economic reconciliation. The third thing is governance timelines, right? The Major Projects Office must wait for the completion of community ceremonies and even elder deliberations before a project is given to go ahead. We often talk about the economy as a machine that just needs more oil and less friction. But the friction we're talking about today is actually the sound of people exercising their rights. If we build a one Canadian economy by silencing the laws that preceded it, we aren't building resilience. We're building on sand. True decentralization means moving power from the Major Projects Office and back into the hands of the nations whose lands are at stake. Thanks for joining me today on Decentralized Voices. I'm William Turner. Stay curious, stay independent, and I'll see you on the next one.